Alrighty, good morning, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. We do have a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We do ask that you please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation, and if you have any questions, we do ask that you go ahead and type those into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will be happy to address them at the end of the program. And if you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted on our social media channels once the talk is over. And if you would like to rewatch this talk or previous virtual talks, please check out our Facebook page. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Miss Eleanor, who is a docent with the Timken, who's going to give our lecture today. And with that, I will hand it over to Miss Eleanor.
Yes, thanks so much, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. Greetings and welcome to today's virtual tour with the Timken. My name is Eleanor, and I'm delighted to be with you for today's presentation, which I've entitled Variations on a Theme. You know, there are certain stories or subject matter that are repeatedly chosen by artists as inspiration for their work, the same ones that capture our attention. I mean, who hasn't seen a whole range of depictions of the Christian story of the Annunciation, depicted by so many great artists over time? In today's docent talk, we'll reflect on the idea that it's not the subject matter, but how an artist paints it that makes a work great. As such, we'll eliminate subject matter as a point of distinction and comparison and focus on how the artist otherwise makes a work compelling. So let's begin with an image that has, well, actually, let's first give a bit more background, because the Jewish historian, I want to start with an image that's fascinated artists from early Christian art through a high point in the Renaissance and to modern times. And that's the image of Salome and the severed head of John the Baptist. Briefly, the story. Well, Jewish historian Josephus, and this dates back to 2030 CE, identifies Salome as a daughter of Herod Antipas and his second wife, Herodias, but doesn't indicate that she was complicit in John the Baptist's execution. Although she's not mentioned by name in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Christian tradition identifies her as one of the women who danced for Herod and Herodias at a birthday celebration for Herod. When offered a prize for her dancing, the daughter asks that John the Baptist be executed. The New Testament stories imply that the girl's mother suggested the execution because John had preached against Herod's divorce from his first wife and his marriage to her, Herodias. Christian tradition would only later identify Salome as the dancer who asked for John the Baptist's head. So this dates back, just wanted to give you a bit of background. The German Renaissance painter Louis Cranach fostered a fascination with beautiful women carrying severed heads. And indisputably, the host of Salome's, Judith's, and other demonic women of fate that swarmed from Cranach's studio owed their popularity to their thrilling sensuality. As in this work, they're icy, sadistic, and triumphant in the extreme attire of classy ladies of the time, endowed with the facial features of the illustrious beauties of the Wittenberg court. In Cranach's depiction, Salome, who's not looking at John's head, has a slight sneer and smile, which hardly fit the gravity of the situation. And John's eyes, only partially open and not looking at her, almost plead with the viewer, the unusual proportions drawing attention to the heads and gaping wound. While not well known, the Florentine painter Benozzo Gozzoli, a student of Fra Angelico, created his own visual take on the Salome story. Gozzoli's depiction provides an interesting account of events at the party, using multiplex narrative. Salome is shown dancing in front of Herod, the bearded man at the center of the table, wearing a red hat and fur-lined red robe, who touches his right hand to his chest and holds a knife on the table in his other hand as he looks at the dancing woman. She's shown again giving Herodias the head of John at the left back of the room. The middle event in the chain, the beheading of John, is shown in the arched side room at the left. About 160 years later, our next Salome, unusually by a female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi, is one of the first paintings to show Salome looking directly at John the Baptist's head. Gentileschi drew on her struggles as a woman in 17th century Italy in her art, and here she gives her Salome agency and plays with Salome's gaze. Salome holds out the platter to get a good look at the severed head, as the executioner gazes at her with awestruck ardor. Skipping ahead a couple of hundred years, we'll turn to depictions of Salome at the turn of the 20th century and consider the following vision of Gustave Moreau. In Moreau's ornate vision, the dancer appears to have conjured the head of the ascetic prophet, whose radiance overshadows her richly dressed form. The psychologically and narratively ambiguous scene is enacted in front of the enthroned king and his wife, as well as the executioner, his sword still wet with blood. A version of this painting was described by the French writer Huysman in his decadent novel of 1884 called Against Nature. And in that novel, Huysman, like many late 19th century writers and artists, considered Salome the ultimate example of a femme fatale. And I quote, "She awakened more energetically the lethargic senses of man. She bewitched and tamed his will more confidently with her charm, that of a large venereal flower, grown in hotbeds of sacrilege, raised in impious greenhouses." We're now ready to take a look at the Timken's very own Salome by Ella Ferris Pell, created at about the same time as Moreau's work. While an important artist in her time, you may well have not heard of Ella Ferris Pell. She had modest success in her lifetime and then was almost completely forgotten. Her Salome is arguably her most important painting, and she never really came close again to doing what she had done in this work. This is perhaps the only surviving photograph of Pell taken during her lifetime. It appeared in the newspapers upon her death and now lives in the Beacon Historical Society in New York. The very young girl in Pell's composition, shown at the Salon of 1890 in Paris, breaks the caste of female as mindless predator. Salome, with downcast eyes, seems to be absorbed in her own thinking about what she's commanded. The platter in her hands has not yet received the head, and you get the sense that this is all about apprehension and looking with some regret about the decisions she's made. It's this attitude which distinguishes Pell's composition from those of her contemporaries. She said when asked about it that the painting is a kind of revulsion against the ugliness of the act. Moving again into the 20th century in our final Salome, we've got a rather unconventional treatment of the subject. An exponent of German Impressionism, Louis Corinth's depiction of Salome is deliberately provocative and salacious. With garish makeup like a nightclub dancer, Salome is in the midst of the action with her bare breasts over Jean the Baptist's head. She uses her fingers to force open his eyes while she stares at the executioner's loincloth. In addition to the servant balancing John the Baptist's head on his own head, are two men who surround the noble lady, but turn their backs on the viewer. One holds a blood-smeared sword in his hand. Two others carry a body, presumably the remains of John's corpse. Behind Salome stands a woman with a fan of peacock feathers. She looks directly at the viewer and thus moves out of the picture, building a bridge to the new world. Next to the mediating figure stands another woman who smiles mockingly. It can be assumed that this is Herodias. As with the Benozzo Gonzoli work, our first work, we have three narrative levels being condensed: the murder with the sword, the handing over of the head as the end, and the conspiracy of the mother in the background. The content of the picture is not so much an excerpt from the legend of Salome, but rather a parody of life. Until then, there had been no version of Salome that so offended the moral sense. We'll now turn from a biblical story to a biblical parable, with a 2,000-year-old story so compelling that artists keep returning to it again and again. And this is, of course, Return of the Prodigal Son. The parable is one in a series of parables that Jesus shared with his disciples on the subject of repentance and forgiveness. The northern Italian artist Giovanni Francesco Barbieri, more commonly known as Il Guercino, a nickname meaning squint-eyed, painted this subject matter on 7 different occasions over a period of almost 40 years. This one at the Timken, likely the last, was commissioned by the Archbishop of Bologna in 1654. In this parable, Jesus speaks of the mercy of God towards repentant sinners. The younger of 2 sons has squandered his share of his father's inheritance. Poor and miserable, he finally decides to return to his father, who lovingly receives him and gives him new clothes. The connection of the father's arms with the son is the focal point of this particular version. And in fact, this is the only version in which Guercino presents this gesture of reconciliation. Now, Guercino sets the painting in his own day. The servant who looks out at us wears 17th century European dress, but the father's Turkish costume would have seemed exotic to the artist's contemporaries and evokes ancient times. Guercino emphasizes the emotions associated with the father's forgiveness and the son's shame and remorse. The scene shows the son returning home, weeping, penitent, dressed in rags and turning slightly away from his father in shame. He raises a tattered cloth to his eye to wipe away tears which fall on his chest as well as his face. His father embraces him, wrapping him in his cloak in a sign of forgiveness and compassion. So let's go back to the servant for a moment. What part does he play in the story? Well, the servant engages the viewer with his direct gaze as a witness to the events unfolding before him, not a participant in the narrative. During the time of this composition in Italy around 1654-55, remember that the Catholic Church, as part of the Counter-Reformation, was using Baroque art as a means of calling back their faithful who had left the church. The Baroque style, with its dramatic expression of movement, emotion, intense colors, and realism, was used as a recruitment tool, drawing people back to the church. The servant boy, looking directly at the viewer and pulling back the curtain, invites us into this story of grace, forgiveness, and salvation, as he beckons the faithful back to the church, regardless of what they've done. Come back home. We forgive. We are welcoming. Rembrandt was also moved by this parable, and he made a variety of drawings, etchings, and paintings on the theme that spanned decades. This version of the story is among the Dutch master's final works, likely completed within 2 years of his death in 1669. And we see here the son, having returned home in a wretched state from travels in which he's wasted his inheritance and fallen into poverty and despair. He kneels before his father in repentance, wishing for forgiveness and the position of a servant in his father's household, having realized that even his father's servants had a better situation in life than he. His father receives him with a tender gesture and welcomes him as his own son. His hands seem to suggest mothering and fathering both at once, the left appearing larger and more masculine, set on the son's shoulder, while the right is softer and more receptive in gesture. Standing at the right is the prodigal son's older brother, who crosses his hands in judgment. In this parable, he objects to the father's compassion for the sinful son. This depiction includes figures not directly related to the parable, but they're also seen in some of his earlier works, and their identities have been debated. The woman at top left, barely visible, is likely the mother, while the seated man, whose dress implies wealth, may be an advisor to the estate or a tax collector. It's interesting that Rembrandt produced such a masterpiece for his own pleasure. This wasn't a commissioned work. So we might ask, what did this story mean to him? At about the same time, but in Spain, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo was also taken with this biblical theme. This series of paintings were commissioned for the decoration of the chapel of the Hospital of Charity in Seville, a private foundation of the Brotherhood of Charity. The program of decoration was designed to illustrate how the charities performed by the Brotherhood were effective in ensuring the internal salvation of its members. The works are known as a narrative cycle, a series of paintings that present a unified story over a number of canvases, like an elaborate comic strip. Murillo only produced 2 narrative cycles of paintings in his career, and The Prodigal Son is the only one that remains complete. While this story was a popular subject with Northern European artists, Murillo's paintings represent the first time a Spanish artist painted the story in serial form and set it in Spain. with figures and backgrounds typical of 17th century Seville. It was an unusual approach for Murillo to take with a religious subject. Most Spanish artists at the time chose to focus on single episodes from religious stories. Now, as background, in 1649, plague struck the city of Seville, and within a year, a quarter of the population had died. It seemed fitting that this story of suffering and redemption would appeal to a patron and a painter during this difficult time. So, starting in the upper left, the first picture depicts the father doling out coins from a sack on the table. He's decided to grant his son's request for an early inheritance so he can go out and adventure on his own. The second work shows the son starting his adventure, leaving his family on horseback, wearing a marvelous red cloak. In the third work, we see the son feasting and spending all his inheritance very rapidly, drinking wine and hanging out with courtesans. The fourth scene on the lower left depicts the prodigal son having spent all his money being expelled from a brothel. The look of terror on his face is quite spectacular and typical of Murillo. The next scene shows the prodigal as a destitute swineherd with his eyes thrown to heaven in a moment in which he's realized the error of his ways. And finally, the final scene of the 6 paintings shows the prodigal son returning to his family home, and his father, in a forgiving gesture, opens his arms ready to accept his son back to the fold. Now, in addition to the series of 6 paintings of the cycle, Murillo painted another depiction of the last scene, which is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And here the artist selected the essential elements of the story's climax: the penitent son welcomed home by his forgiving father, the rich garments and ring that signify the errant son's restoration to his former position in the family, and the fatted calf being led to slaughter for the celebratory banquet. The larger-than-life, central, pyramidal grouping of father and son dominates the picture, while the richest color, the very expensive, deep aquamarine pigment, is reserved for the servant bearing the new garments. Murillo may have chosen to emphasize that aspect of the parable to perhaps emphasize the charitable nature of the Brothers of Charity Foundation. Murillo's motto was the life around him. Part of the appeal of this canvas lies in its human touches, the realism of the prodigal's dirty feet, the puppy jumping up to greet his master, and perhaps most of all, the ingenuous smile of the little urchin leading the calf. In our final work on this theme, the prodigal son receives an updated retelling in this Depression-era painting by Thomas Hart Benton. Here, Benton explores a Dust Bowl version of the biblical story in which the young man's return comes too late. The homestead is in ruins, the chimney stands aslant like a tombstone over a dilapidated grave, and the cow is but a skeleton. The clouds take on the shapes of howling dogs. This ironic twist to the biblical story underscores both the grim reality of conditions in the Midwest during the 1930s and 40s and the artist's personal experiences with events that were beyond any man's power to control. Regardless of where we see ourselves in the parable, the father, the household, the older brother, the prodigal son, the timeless message of hope after trials is one that still touches us today, as it touches all the many artists who painted all the prodigal sons. Another biblical source of rich artistic inspiration is a passage in Matthew that mentions the three kings who traveled to witness the nativity of Jesus and to give him three gifts: frankincense, gold, and myrrh. This is, of course, the story of the adoration of the Magi, and we'll start with the Timkins' own work. Although the identity of the artist responsible for this small devotional painting is today unknown, the renowned art historian Max Friedlander attributed this work to the so-called master of the St. Lucy legend. That artist worked in Bruges and perhaps also in Spain during the late 15th century. The interest shown in resplendent fabrics and in rendering the deep spatial recession of landscape elements are typical of this artist, as is the sweet, almost resigned expression of the Virgin. Scholars feel certain that the artist who painted the Timkins' adoration of the Magi must have been familiar with other great Netherlandish paintings of the same subject, particularly the version painted by Hans Memling that is today at the Prado in Madrid. Memling's work is comprised of three panels. On the left, the Nativity, the adoration of the Magi, and the presentation in the temple. In this work, the unified space represented in the Nativity and the adoration is noteworthy. It was an innovation to place scenes from the Epiphany and the birth under the same architecture represented from different points of view. And although it's commonly accepted today that one of the three kings is Black, this wasn't original to the tale. In visual terms, a Black magus didn't appear until the 14th century and only became commonplace around 1500. It's been suggested that the blackness of Balthazar's skin showed that he was from a distant land and symbolized Christianity's attempts at global appeal to all of humanity, even the most remote people. Thus, we see in both these works a handsome African king, Balthazar, striding into the scene from the right, holding a jewel-encrusted reliquary in his left hand. It's in this context that we can see the significance of Memling's painting. Not only does his work reflect many of the conventions that would define the Black magus, his youth, his flashy dress, his noble bearing, his exotic attendance, his positioning to the side, even a fluttering standard referring to Saint Maurice. But the painting itself was a means by which these conventions diffused across Central Europe. What had previously been a practice specific to a few areas, most notably the area around Cologne, where Memling had apprenticed, was taken by him to the Low Countries. His prominence in Bruges helped to draw attention to this trend and diffuse it more widely. At about the same time is Andrea Mantegna's close-up depiction of the story. Three kings pay homage to the Christ child, who in turn makes a sign of blessing. Jesus Christ, his mother, the Virgin Mary, and Mary's husband, Joseph, have halos and wear simple garments, while the Magi are dressed in exotic clothing and jewels and bear exquisite gifts. I lighten the image so you can hopefully, I know it barely see the halos on the Virgin and the Christ child. Caspar, bearded and bareheaded, presents the Christ child with a rare Chinese cup made of delicate porcelain and filled with gold coins. Melchior, the younger, bearded king behind Caspar, holds a Turkish censer for perfuming the air with incense. And on the right, Balthazar the Moor carries a covered cup made of agate. Andrea Mantegna's composition of figures and objects compressed within a shallow space, was based on his study of ancient Roman reliefs. He used a neutral background and sharply defined details to focus the viewer's attention on the three kings' adoration of Christ. Our last work depicting the Magi story is by Velázquez, who presents us with a contemporary take. In this early painting by Velázquez, the distant background is vaguely lit. The artist uses the typical Baroque technique of chiaroscuro, highlighting the crucial difference between lightness and darkness in order to create a dramatic scene. And he used real people as examples and models for the painting. The Magus with a gray beard is a portrait of Pacheco, the artist's teacher. The Virgin Mary was painted from Juana, Pacheco's daughter, and Velázquez painted himself as one of the young kings giving a present to the Christ child. Indeed, Velázquez was unaware of the garments that would have been worn at the time when Christ was born, so he made the decision to give all of his characters contemporary clothing. Nevertheless, he managed to retain the Madonna's holy and virginal image, full of submission and calmness. He made Jesus's figure the brightest one in the painting. One can almost see the rays of light coming from the child's head, like a tiny halo. The painting seems so modern, based on the contemporary garments and the liveliness of the scene, that one almost forgets about the holiness of the subject. Considering the large scale of the canvas, it could easily be displayed in a church. Yet the other absence of spiritualism in the painting is so strong that it could also be simply portraying a regular Spanish celebration of a new infant. All the essential attributes of the famous biblical scene are missing. There are no feathers nor gold on the Magi's garments. Jesus is tightly tucked in as compared to other paintings depicting the same subject. And most importantly, there's no shed or barn. Velázquez intentionally omits all sacred meaning from the scene, leaving the spectator to make mere assumptions on what the true subject is. We'll close our tour today with three quite different depictions of Cupid and Psyche, a story originally from Metamorphoses, also called The Golden Ass, which was written in the 2nd century AD. The tale concerns the overcoming of obstacles to the love between Psyche and Cupid and their ultimate union in a sacred marriage. Many artists have chosen to depict the story, each taking on a different element. Here's how Anthony van Dyck interprets the story. Van Dyck's Cupid and Psyche is the only surviving mythological painting from Van Dyck's employment as Charles I's court artist. We're not certain of the provenance of the work. It may be one of a series of canvases illustrating the story of Cupid and Psyche, which was ordered for the Queen's house at Greenwich. This project, which involved also Sir Peter Paul Rubens, was never completed, which may explain the painting's lack of a frame and finish. On the other hand, the painting may have been made as part of the marriage celebrations of Princess Mary and William II of Orange in April and May of 1641. Van Dyck's mistress, Margaret Lemon, may have been the model for Psyche. In classical mythology, Venus, jealous of Psyche's beauty, set her a number of tasks, the last of which was to bring her a small portion of Persephone's beauty from Hades in an unopened casket. Psyche, overcome by curiosity, opened the casket and released not beauty, but sleep from which she is roused by Cupid. Psyche represents earthly beauty, while Cupid is desire aroused by her beauty. The intimacy and tension of the figures result from a number of simple but striking contrasts. The warmth of Cupid's flesh tones and drapery against the coolness of Psyche's skin and cloak. The speed and energy as he barely touches the ground next to the weight of her sleeping corpse. Cupid enters like an Annunciate angel with hope, while she assumes the form of a dead Christ in lamentation. The diagonals of their bodies are echoed by the dead and living trees beyond, which reinforce the idea of Cupid's touch, bringing life back to the dead. The neoclassical French painter Jacques-Louis David used the story of Cupid and Psyche, which would have been well known in his time in 1817, to explore the conflict between idealized love and physical reality. Cupid, lover of the beautiful mortal Psyche, visited her nightly on the condition she did not know his identity. Cupid was usually depicted as an ideal adolescent, but here David presents him as an ungainly teenager, smirking at his sexual conquest. David took inspiration from a number of ancient texts, including an obscure, recently published Greek poem that describes Cupid as a mean-spirited brat with dark skin, flashing eyes, and curly hair. The work drew mixed reviews. Some people were thrilled by the novelty of it, and they understood that David was doing a subject they'd seen many times before in a way they'd never seen before, in a way that gave life to the classical tradition. Other people thought it was crass and vulgar and wrong to present these gods that were supposed to be so beautiful in a way that didn't seem to take into account the nobility appropriate for the tradition. David would likely have been very amused by all this. Now, here's a fun fact. Psyche in Greek means both soul and butterfly, and it's likely why David depicts two butterflies in the work. On the left, you see one butterfly decorated on the bottom of the bed, in the middle, a very traditional neoclassical butterfly. And then on the right, you have this insect that's flying above their heads. And perhaps it's meant to be a bit of a joke. You have this goddess associated with the butterfly, but David is showing you that it's a real living insect, apparently a cabbage butterfly. So not a multicolored, beautiful insect, but something much more common, ordinary, and real. Finally, in 1889, William Adolphe Bouguereau, a French academic painter, portrays the story through the innocence of children. In this painting, Bouguereau was inspired to paint the two lovers as children, demonstrating that fate itself had a hand in their meeting. They were born to be together. The subtle paint handling captures the children's innocence and illustrates to the viewer that Cupid's original attraction to Psyche was not purely physical, but also platonic, for the innocence of childhood doesn't allow for anything else. You can't have true love without also having a mutual trust and respect, and a relaxed and enduring companionship between lovers. Cupid and Psyche's union, then, is not just physical. They're soulmates and complement each other eternally. And on that romantic note, we'll end our tour today. I hope you've enjoyed our romp through duplicity, but not complicity, seeing how different artists have interpreted the same theme in ever so many ways. And of course, I welcome any comments or questions. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And with that, we just have a couple minutes for some questions. Again, feel free to type them in or to unmute yourself as well. Okay, if we don't have any questions, then we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again, Eleanor. And yeah, so if you guys have any questions or would like to know more about upcoming events, please check out our events page on our website. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you can join us again for our next virtual talk on Thursday, May 25th. Yeah, have a good day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.